Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. We are doing another session in our Russian speaker series today. I'm Jeff Mankoff with the Russian Eurasia program here at CSIS, and it's my great privilege to moderate our discussion today with Rachel Salzman, who's the author of the new book, Russia, BRICS, and the Disruption of Global Order, which I'm told you'll be able to purchase outside. Rachel most recently was a visiting scholar at the Department of European and Eurasian Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, has also been affiliated with Georgetown, Carnegie, and a bunch of other places. She's got this new book out, which is very timely. It talks about the history of Russia's challenge to global order, its efforts to create alternative forms of global order, which is something that has continued down to the present in various forms. Rachel's going to talk about the book for a little while, and then we're going to have a conversation up here, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please do silence your cell phones and other noise-making devices, and if you want to move closer to the front, please feel free to do that. And then if there are no objections, I'll turn the floor over to Rachel.
Great, thank you, Jeff. It's lovely to be here. It's great to see some familiar faces in the audience. So as Jeff said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the book, where it comes from, what its main topics and arguments are, and then we'll go from there. So I just want to start with saying that the title of today's event, Putin, America, and BRICS, is actually a bit of a feint, and intentionally so. BRICS both is and isn't about Putin, and it is and it isn't about the US. And that's actually a lot of what I look at in the book. So on the BRICS side, BRICS responds to some real failings in the current world order, but it also clearly has some strong strains of anti-Westernism and anti-Americanism. And it's important to hold those nuances simultaneously, that it is both against us and not against us for a variety of competing or complementary reasons. Similarly, Putin has been a driver in the creation of BRICS, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But the BRICS process, or Russia's goals in bringing BRICS together, is in some ways just a new form, or maybe a more global and successful form, of a very long-standing strain in Russian foreign policy since the end of the Cold War, Soviet foreign policy, and even imperial foreign policy. So you're not looking at anything that is a qualitatively new development in how Russia's leaders have historically encountered the global system. It is a new twist on an old story, if you will. So if you're looking at the roots of this, and that's really where I come from, right? What struck me initially about the story of BRICS is Russia's ongoing struggle or inability to find an appropriate place in the post-Cold War order, right? We all know the story, or a lot of us know the story, of the 1990s efforts to bring Russia into Western institutions, the IMF, the G7, and then the G8, and what that was about. Initial offers for Russia to be part of Partnership for Peace in 1994, and how a lot of that then falls apart for a variety of reasons, both domestic in terms of how privatization proceeded in the 90s under Yeltsin, also concerns in Russia over NATO enlargement, and concerns over whether what that meant and what NATO's role in the post-Cold War order should be. I think it's also worth saying that there continues to be a real disagreement over Western and American motives in the 1990s. The most magnanimous interpretation of US foreign policy toward Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s is very much bring them into our institutions and they will become like us, and this will be good for everyone. It will lead to political stability, it will lead to economic growth, and it will lead to peace because you don't shoot your best customer. And if you build the economics, then the rest will follow. I think that has proved basically untrue, but that doesn't mean that, if you will, America's heart was in the wrong place. By the late 1990s, you do see a real deterioration of this, and by 1997, you have the beginning of what Russia will term the beginning of BRICS history, and that is Primakov, who is then the prime minister. He had also been foreign minister at some point. Yevgeny Primakov suggestion in the Delhi airport that Russia, India, and China coordinate and form what he called a strategic triangle. It became RIC, Russia, India, China, and those three countries are really the core of what Russia sees in BRICS. India and China were not terribly enthused about this process, mainly because they saw it as too anti-American. You then lose a few years, partly because of the financial collapse in 1998 in Russia, a variety of other processes. And by 2003, when you again have an ebbing of the US-Russia relationship as a result of the Yukos affair within Russia, the American invasion of Iraq, and a variety of other related forces. And you also have a set of rising powers that have been identified by the banking world, in this case Goldman Sachs, as those who will lead the new global economy and what that means. And Goldman Sachs is mainly looking at it from a banking perspective, from an investment perspective. But the countries themselves, and in this case particularly Russia and Brazil, focus in on it as something that can become a political coordinating platform, if you will. And I always think it's very interesting to remember that BRICS, which has developed into something which can absolutely be interpreted through an anti-Western lens, even if that is not its only purpose, comes from a Western bank's idea, right? And they have capitalized on the idea of BRICS, even as BRICS, the Goldman Sachs term of these are the countries that have the highest GDP per growth, most population, et cetera, and are going to lead the global economy, has become, we are going to be the new powers in the new global order. Putin pushes very hard on the creation of BRICS beginning in 2005. And that process sort of proceeds apace with meetings of foreign ministers on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly, meetings on the sidelines of the G8. But what you then have in 2008 with the global financial crisis is the seizing of an opportunity, right? With the global financial crisis, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers on September 15th, 2008, you have enormous fear in the US of decoupling from the rising powers, that they will go on and create their own system, and that the US and the other leading Western powers should probably come to an accommodation with them now while we still have some weight before we lose all leverage. That obviously didn't happen exactly, but it did give BRICS an opening to coordinate and to really burst forth. And the development of BRICS since 2008 has proceeded, I would say, somewhat independently from what Putin wished for when he started initiating meetings in 2005. And so what you have by 2014, which is a real fulcrum in the story of Russia and BRICS because of the onset of the crisis in Ukraine, or sort of the major developments, if you will. The onset was 2013, but with the annexation of Crimea, that's where stuff gets really interesting from the BRICS perspective. And by 2014, you have a Russia that is quite isolated from the international system, that is looking at the various alternate institutional alignments it has pursued since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this includes the Eurasian Economic Union, the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, and BRICS, to figure out which alignments will give it the most leverage and will also serve the most purpose, because all of a sudden Russia's out of the G8 and it is under sanctions, which has an economic effect, not just the obvious, but it needs new trading partners. Most of Russia's trade, energy-wise, Europe was its biggest consumer. China has been Russia's largest trading partner since, I believe, about 2011, but in terms of dollars spent and certainly price paid for gas and for oil, Europe was way ahead. So what you have in 2014 is a moment of looking, and can BRICS, which for Russia has been about talking about a new world order and talking about how the Western system is insufficient and BRICS is a new option that is truly democratic, by which he means, of course, not internal democracy, but every voice, every country, every major power, which is not every country, gets an equal voice. Can this then become something that's operationally useful for Russia? And so these are all themes that I explore in the book. in rather more detail, also going into really looking at how Russian rhetoric, particularly elite political rhetoric, which is to say primarily Putin, but also Medvedev when he was president, and some speeches by Sergei Lavrov, the longstanding foreign minister as well, how do they talk about the idea of BRICS and why does that matter? And the argument there is what they say is important for understanding how they wish Russian foreign policy to be perceived and where they wish it to go, even if those aren't the ultimate policy outcomes. So I think I've given enough of an overview that we can hopefully then move to some discussion, and I'm certainly happy to answer questions after.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for the overview. So let me start by asking you a little bit about BRICS and what it actually does. I focus on this region, and I don't have a great sense of what BRICS does. I think for most people in the United States, even most policy practitioners, there's also a little bit of mystification about what the operations of this, I don't even want to call it an organization, but this forum actually look like. Maybe you could say a little bit about
Sure, that's a great
why
question.
BRICS?
And it's also often one of the fundamental questions. I think there's two parts of that. One is what is BRICS, and the other is how should BRICS be understood. What is BRICS has changed over time. When you had the first meeting of deputy foreign ministers in 2005, it was a chance for, at the time, 4 countries, now 5 countries because South Africa joined in 2011, to talk about their discontents and cooperate on issues of interest. It then became more formalized after the financial crisis because you start seeing BRICS operate essentially as a pressure group within the G20. And to this day, they meet on the sidelines of the G20, they pre-coordinate, and they use that pre-coordination to push their objectives. The biggest example of this was the successful adoption by the G20 and then by the IMF of a change in quota weights and voting weights, therefore, in the IMF. That went through in 2010. It didn't actually go into effect until 2015, but that had more to do with our Congress than with the G20 or the IMF. In addition to being, at the beginning, an effective pressure group, excuse me, it also developed from that cooperation what Oliver Stunkel, who is a Brazilian scholar on BRICS, has called the spillovers of cooperation. What that means in practical terms is the BRICS leaders realized it was effective to cooperate on the sidelines of the G20 and sort of wondered where else cooperation would be effective. And they started exploring that and developed initially 5 to 6 working groups, and they now have, I believe, upwards of 15. They meet throughout the year. They have annual leaders summits. They have annual ministerials for each major. And also, most importantly, they have annual, or not even annual, they have multiple sub-ministerial meetings. What this means is the people who actually get stuff done, not the pretty face or the big name who takes the picture, but the people who are going to do the negotiating and who are going to figure out what cooperation looks like, are having regular contacts. And this contact represents the interests of each BRICS country differently. So for example, Russia, which is more interested on the political side, initiated meetings of national security advisors. Those have been going on since 2009. Brazil, which was chairing the G20 in 2009, and also, like India and China, tend to be more interested in the geo-economic side rather than geopolitical side of BRICS, initiated finance minister meetings, and trade minister meetings also happen, but you also have a lot of stuff that's focused on development. What these are 5 developing countries. Russia is sort of developed, sort of developing, and sort of misdeveloped, but it certainly has a lot of issues in terms of the structure of its market, poverty, infrastructure, a lot of things that we think of as problems of the developing world that Russia can benefit from conversation about. Now, we can have a conversation about whether cooperating in the BRICS format is the best way for these countries to accomplish those objectives. But if we're looking at it holistically and sort of from a non-value-based assessment, what BRICS is developed into a full-fledged format for cooperation among these countries on a variety of issues of political and economic concern. And it also developed its own institutions which are active. The BRICS Development Bank, was formed in 2014 at the Fortaleza Summit. They announced in the recent BRICS Summit in Brasilia, which took place in mid-November, that they will be continuing their process of opening regional offices in all BRICS countries. They already have one in South Africa. That happened fairly early. India and Russia will be up in 2020. It's headquartered in Hong Kong. Sorry, in China, in Beijing, I believe, but possibly Shanghai. And you also have a contingency reserve arrangement, which is essentially a currency pool for emergency liquidity. So what BRICS is another global institution. It's not an institution the way we think about institutions, and I think that's the other half of it, right? Western scholars or Western media will look at BRICS and say, this makes no sense. You have 5 countries that have different economic structures, different places in the global pecking order, different major exports, different political leadership. What the heck do they have to cooperate on, right? If you look at the 3 contiguous Eurasian members, which is to say Russia, China, and India, obviously they have some overlapping security concerns, but even there, China and India have an ongoing territorial dispute. They almost came to kinetic conflict in September 2017, right before the summit in Xiamen. So what the heck is going on? And it's a really interesting question, but I think it's the wrong question. I think we, especially since the end of the Cold War, are conditioned to look at global institutions or alliances on the basis of shared values, on the basis of similarities. And that's not how these countries look at it. They look at it as, can we cooperate on limited shared aims? And they do, and they can. And sometimes that means a shared aim at a very high level of abstraction, right? So if you look at global economic governance, what China wants out of global economic governance is quite different, really, from what Russia wants out of a reform of global economic governance. What they both want, though, is for the US to have less power in global economic governance. So they can cooperate on language that talks about there being a more democratic distribution, which everyone understands to mean the US should have less power, without having to get into the details of China should have this much and Russia should have this much and India should have this much, right? And I think that that ability to coordinate at the level that they agree while not dealing with the places that they don't agree is an enormous strength of BRICS and is something that Western analysts tend to miss, and I think to our detriment.
So that kind of gets to the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which is the title of the book is Russia, BRICS, and the Disruption of Global Order. So I wanted to ask about the disruption of global order piece, because it sounds like this is a very decentralized organization, or maybe organization is not even the right word. It's a very decentralized forum where there are opportunities for the leadership of the 5 countries to get together and create common positions around issues of mutual concern. Now, as you alluded to at the end of your remarks there, some of that has to do, particularly when it comes to Moscow and Beijing, with reducing the role that the United States plays in global institutions of various kinds. But that's maybe one piece of what BRICS does, and I don't know the extent to which that objective is shared by, let's say, South Africa or India or other countries who have, much different kinds of relationships with the United States. But how does BRICS as a collective, as a forum or an organization, if we want to call it that, how does it affect global order? How does it affect the way that global politics and global governance is done and has been done in the post-Cold War world?
Sure. I think the best answer to that is if everyone can think back to high school chemistry and you think about reactions that go both ways, right? You have the funny little sort of half arrows that go in both directions to the different reagents.
That was a really long time ago.
Wow. That is what I always think of in non-chemistry terms. What that means is BRICS is both a symptom and a cause of what Bobo Lo has called current disorder, right? Now, with the caveat that the Western order was never quite as Western and never quite as ordered as we like to tell ourselves it was. Amitav Acharya from AU has an excellent book on this from 2014. It was mostly ordered and mostly Western. BRICS is a symptom of, breaking is too harsh a word and sometimes. BRICS is a symptom of the shifts in that order as you have seen global economic growth get more distributed, which is to say, the US is a smaller percentage of global growth now than it was in 1991, right? That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing, right? But if you consider that economic power leads to political power, it also goes the other way, but working from that perspective, the shift in global economic growth to countries that were historically not fast growers and therefore not powerful globally has meant that there has had to be some redistribution, or there has been a push for redistribution of political power. And BRICS is very much a symptom of that. I said at the beginning that BRICS is a reaction to some real failures or lacunas in the current order, and I think that's true, right? If you look at the IMF, Belgium in 1944 should have had a pretty big role and India shouldn't have. That's not necessarily true now, and that's not to knock Belgium, right? India is now growing faster and has a larger economy, and that's fine. But you need to have shifts, and so BRICS is a symptom of dissatisfaction that those shifts didn't happen fast enough. Where I think it is the actor as opposed to the symptom is more on the values side. And this is something that I talk about at length in the chapter looking at BRICS and Russian foreign policy following the onset of the crisis in Ukraine. And the issue is as follows. If you think about Western order, there's really two sides of it. There's economics and there's norms and values. Economics is mainly market. We can talk about the extent to which the US is or isn't a market economy, or and to which the other countries also are or are not market economies as envisioned sort of by classical economic models. But it is free market on one side and democracy, human rights, et cetera, on the other. On the values side, both of those have shifted since the institutions were formed at the end of at the end of World War II. So what is embodied in the Bretton Woods institutions or in NATO or in the European steel and coal and steel community, which of course becomes the EU, shifts over time between 1945, 1944, and 1991, and even now. But I would say that the political norms have shifted even more. There is more emphasis on the importance of democracy, on the importance of human rights, on the ability to make comments on another country's domestic order because of running roughshod over values that we hold to be very important. And again, that's not a bad thing. Some of that comes from the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, but some of it also comes from growing recognition that there are some things that should not happen. The place where BRICS, I think, is really problematic on this front is an unwillingness to stand up for many of those values. That doesn't mean that Brazil or India doesn't believe that you shouldn't have human rights abuses. But if you look at the actions, particularly with regard to the UN Resolution 262 in 2014, which was the resolution on the territorial integrity of Ukraine, which comes to a fundamental tenet of the post-World War II Western order, which is to say you do not change borders by force. You have 5 major countries who are unwilling to stand up for that. Russia obviously vetoed the resolution for, not surprising reasons, but the other 4 BRICS countries abstained. Abstaining is not the same thing as saying, no, we think this is wrong, but it is, to me at least, pretty clear evidence that they're not willing to stand up and say this is wrong. And if you have 5 major powers who are not willing to say that what the US and Europe think of as fundamental to peace and security underpinning our order is important, that's a pretty problematic situation. And I think that it suggests the splintering of agreement on norms to a much greater extent than the formation of BRICS suggests any kind of fracturing of the global economic order. I actually think the BRICS economic institutions will change the global economic order, especially if they ultimately come out with lending that is either predatory or we already know it doesn't necessarily come with the same governance strings, but it is not necessarily pernicious. Unwillingness to say there are certain norms that underpin global order, I think can end up being much more pernicious.
So the example of the UN resolution on Ukraine's territorial integrity is interesting, precisely for the reasons that you pointed out, that these countries, including some that have their own concerns about territoriality, Taiwan and Tibet, for instance, in China, were not willing to vote on this resolution in a way that would assert that this was a norm that needed to be upheld. So there is clearly some overlap in terms of the way that these countries think about at least certain aspects of world order. But these are also countries that are geographically very widely dispersed. They're on multiple continents. They're at very different stages of economic development. I think describing Russia as misdeveloped in a lot of ways is pretty accurate, and certainly it's in a very different place developmentally from, let's say, South Africa. These are countries that have very different histories. Some of them are former empires, some of them are former colonies. They have different relationships with the United States. They have different kinds of political systems. India is more or less a democracy. Russia is less a democracy. China is clearly not. Yet there is a certain degree of overlap, as we've been talking about, but it also seems like there's an awful lot that divides these countries. So how do they manage those disagreements, and to what extent is there a common vision for what BRICS is among its 5 members?
Sure. I think that's actually one of the places where BRICS is most vulnerable, with a couple of caveats. First off, BRICS negotiations are a black box, certainly to an American scholar, right? When I did field work, both for the dissertation and then while turning it into a book, and I was in Russia for field work while dissertating for about 8 months, and then did interviews in India, China, and then back in Russia while I was preparing the book manuscript. Spoke to a lot of scholars and people who are in the room also for BRICS negotiations. They won't tell me what gets said, and that's fine. But it does mean there are limits to what I can see and know. What is really clear, though, is I think a couple of things. First off, I spoke about Russia, sorry, I'm so conditioned to say Russia. I spoke about BRICS's success in slaloming around disagreements, right? That you have India and China almost coming to armed conflict in September 2017, and then 2 weeks later, 1 week later, having a delightful summit in Xiamen, right? This is a great strength, right? That they are able to basically just not talk about the things they don't want to talk about. The other thing that I think is pretty clear from speaking to scholars in those 3 BRICS countries, and also Oliver Stunkel, as I mentioned, from Brazil, is what happens behind closed doors is also clearly not quite as democratic as everyone would like us to believe. Which is to say, if there's something China doesn't want to talk about, it's not going to happen. If there's something China doesn't want in the summit statement, it's not going to be in there. That's not to say that China wins all the fights, right? A very famous one that China lost is that China wanted for the new development bank to have a system where you could pay in more and therefore have more power. And they lost that fight. They pay in more, but it's one country, one vote. And that's interesting, right? They don't win everything. There are clearly dynamics happening. That having been said, they don't have a common vision for what BRICS will be. And I think that that is partly because of differences among the powers, right? In your previous question, you had asked whether kind of the anti-Western side of things was shared by South Africa and India. I would say absolutely yes. They both have strong histories of being non-aligned or, in an anti-Western American camp for different reasons than Russia does, right? A lot of what's interesting about BRICS is you have agreement up here, even if the reasoning is quite different from all 5 countries. But the other issue is when you're talking about a common vision, then you do have to get down to more granularity, which is to say you have to agree that China should have X amount of power and Russia should have Y amount of power. And I think they're not going to get there. You also fundamentally, not fundamentally, but not for nothing, have to agree on what the UN Security Council is going to look like, right? China and Russia are pretty happy with the UN Security Council. India, Brazil, and South Africa have been looking to become permanent members for a really long time. Russia and the US actually have both formally endorsed India as a permanent member. No one has endorsed any of those three aspirants to having a veto also, right? So there's changes in the political order that would have to happen that they're not, or I would be surprised if they're going to reach agreement on in BRICS. But they also are all pursuing their own regional order initiatives. And I think that also limits BRICS' ability to pursue a global vision. Some of that also de-emphasizes BRICS. If you look at China really since 2015 or so, it is much more focused on the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, the AIIB, which dates from 2013 but starts getting going a bit later. And of course the Belt and Road Initiative, which is all things to all people all the time. So it's much less organized than I think we like to, or believe it to be sometimes if you read some of the commentary. But it is clearly the top initiative as compared to something like BRICS, right? And BRI is global in scope, right? It has an Arctic element with the Polar Silk Road. It has a bunch of maritime belts. It has the Silk Road Economic Belt, which goes over what my old boss used to call the Greater Eurasian landmass, which is to say from China all the way, to the Iberian Peninsula. So that's China's focus. India has been a little unhappy with how Russia-China relations have developed since 2014, and so it also has started looking elsewhere. It has some pretty strong security agreements with the US at this point, which are fairly new. But you also have an Indian leadership that has made some calculations about how best it can develop. And those calculations come up with an answer of it needs closer relations with the West, maybe, rather than China and India. And of course, you have longstanding China-India tension. China is India's largest trading partner and is a major player in the Indian economy, but there's more of a desire for hedging than I think you see in Russia at this point, at least publicly. I think also, and as my last point, BRICS works best when it is flexible. Right? If you look at the UN resolution on Ukraine's territorial integrity, the 4 other members abstained for different reasons. They didn't, I would be surprised if any of them abstained because they thought Russia was right? And that sort of doesn't matter, right? The story that Russia gets to spin about the abstentions is, from Russia's perspective, substantially more important than why the country has abstained. But the different reasons for why the countries abstained is exactly why BRICS' flexibility is so important to its long-term survival, right? It's a Rorschach test. Every country gets out of BRICS what it appreciates. So for Brazil, for example, it's a summit where it sits equally with China. There aren't a lot of those, if any. For Russia, it's showing the US and Europe that it has other high-power friends and other high-power markets with which it can do business. Things like that, right? Once you start trying to get into something more ironclad, I think you run into problems, and no country, including Russia, would want that kind of restraint on their strategic independence.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question about Russia, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. But how important is BRICS in Russia's overall strategic conception and its overall approach to foreign policy, and how does it relate to other multilateral organizations that Russia has supported or created, including, you mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also things like the Eurasian Economic Union. There's now this notion of a Greater Eurasia Partnership. Which BRIC, with a K, is BRICS, CS, in this bigger construct of Russian multilateralism?
That is a shifting question, or rather, that question has a shifting answer. I would argue that BRICS is substantially less important to Russia now than it was 4 years ago. Some of that is because of the trends I mentioned in China and India, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, are absolutely the two most important BRICS for Russia. Russian leaders would never say that. They like talking about BRICS as, you know, a dialogue of civilizations, and it's important because it's global, and maybe it should bring in a Muslim civilization, not realizing that India has one of the world's largest Muslim populations, but that's a different conversation, right? So it was very important. It was, if you look at the period, especially from sort of the end of the reset, the US-Russia reset, which sort of basically November-ish 2011, which is when you see US-Russia and NATO-Russia missile defense cooperation collapse fairly spectacularly after what looked like actually some really promising steps. BRICS is quite important rhetorically and then quite important practically from about the end of 2011 through the end of 2015. I say the end of 2015 because that's also when Russia's BRICS chairmanship ended, more or less. It's not a January to December chairmanship, but they held their summit in July-ish, and the handover happened at some point towards the end of the year to India, I believe. So at the point that you have China and India pursuing other options, and Russia is no longer the chair, you see it de-emphasized, and the emphasis shifts to the Eurasian Economic Union, and also especially to this Greater Eurasian Partnership. And why the Greater Eurasian Partnership? Because that's Russia's word for how it's coordinating with BRI, right? The Greater Eurasian Partnership, if you ask Russian scholars to define it, it's sort of fun in that no one can really, which is fine. I think loose concepts are incredibly important in international politics. I don't mean that glibly, right? But Russia has quite adeptly, honestly, changed its narrative to being the major Eurasian partner on BRI. And that is what Eurasian Economic Union and the Greater Eurasian Partnership have gotten folded into. And if you look at the SCO or the CSTO or the Eurasian Economic Union separate from the Greater Eurasian Partnership, I think all of those are still probably more important to Russia in the sense of Russia thinks more regionally in terms of control, even though it thinks of itself as a global major power, right? I think everyone, or at least every scholar that I have spoken to in the US or read, is pretty much agreed that Russia's ideal global order is the Concert of Vienna, right? With some different countries at the table. But that's what it wants, right? And so regional organizations that buttress it in its region are the most important. But I would say the Greater Eurasian Partnership and the Eurasian Economic Union are the two that at the moment are at the top of the pile, and BRICS is about to get boosted up because Russia will have the chairmanship in 2020, and it's already releasing some things about what it's going to do and what it's going to support, but I think that will be ephemeral and over once it switches again for 2021.
Okay, why don't we open it up to the audience now? So please raise your hand. I will call on people to ask questions. We've got microphones, so please wait for a microphone. When you get one, please identify yourself so we know who you are, and please also ask a question. That is, don't make a statement. So, okay.
All right, my name is Bill Cruzy. I'm just a taxpayer. I find Brazil's role in this to be very interesting because they've had a big change in government. I mean, they got rid of the socialists. They have a government that's more populist, more market-oriented. And also they have a lot of issues with Russia with respect to its involvement in Venezuela. There's a lot of refugees pouring into Brazil from Venezuela. So there's tension with Russia over that. But as you say, there's things that they don't talk about.
Sorry, was there a question?
So maybe
So
Brazil's
talk
view
about
of
okay, so.
I just say this, I'm just curious that why Brazil is still participating in this when they seem to have more issues with Russia than agreements.
Sure. Well, I always get a little nervous when I get questions about Brazil because I am much more of an expert on Russia, China, and India. So with that caveat, I think that's a great question, and it's something that BRICS watchers, less so than Russia watchers, have been asking since Bolsonaro came in. And there were questions about whether Bolsonaro would actually host the summit, since Brazil was scheduled to have the chairmanship this year, and that was scheduled long before the elections that brought Bolsonaro to power. I think what's clear, right, if they have a statement, the BRICS summit statement this time is maybe about 25 paragraphs shorter than it has been in previous years. I actually think that's a good thing. I think BRICS does better when it focuses, to quote Lenin, as my old boss used to do, better, fewer, but better, right?
I don't think one can say the same thing about the NATO summit declaration,
No.
unfortunately.
Well, luckily, that's not what I'm here to talk about today, so isn't that nice? So they had what seems to have been a successful summit, which of course everyone is calling a successful summit. But I think the issue for Brazil in BRICS is not Russia, it's China, right? China is the major investor in Brazil, particularly in terms of a great number of infrastructure projects, right? Railways and various other things, also resource extraction. And you are not wrong that Russia's actions in Venezuela have some not great knock-on effects for Brazil, but I don't think Brazil is in BRICS for Russia. Brazil is in BRICS for its own reasons that I would say are mostly China, and also to keep up coordination with IBSA. IBSA is India, Brazil, South Africa. You can get super lost in all of the various acronyms. It's actually a lot of fun. IBSA was formed in 2003 after India, Brazil, and South Africa were invited to the Evian G8 summit, and were basically really unhappy that they were invited to join for dinner and not for any substantive conversations. And the three leaders said, well, we have serious concerns and we should start coordinating, and we are the democracies of the global South. It's a bit more nuanced, but that was the upshot. IBSA coordinated off and on, certainly much less regularly than BRICS did once it got going. IBSA also basically stopped meeting as IBSA once South Africa was brought into BRICS in 2011. It has recently held a summit, but for the most part, IBSA has been folded into BRICS, right? So Brazil in BRICS also gets the ongoing cooperation with South Africa and India, with which it has longstanding ties and shared interests, right? And probably many more shared interests than it has with Russia and China, right? Brazil and India and South Africa are also multi-ethnic. They have separatist issues. They're multilingual, right? A lot of different issues. So if you are looking at Bolsonaro's decision to host, that is in fact, or to follow through with his commitment to host, if you will, that is in fact example A of the extent to which BRICS is a Rorschach test for its members, and each one gets out of it what it finds important. And what Brazil, I would argue, finds important is a platform to sit down with China, an occasion where Xi Jinping is going to make a state visit, or I assume diplomatically it might not be called a state visit, but a formal visit with formal meetings in Brasilia, right? That's useful. That's very important optics, right? So I would imagine that the Brazil Russia sit down that happened, I don't remember whether it was a leader level or lower down, was maybe more tense than it might have been. There's also ongoing forever conversations about whether the Brazilian airline company is going to cooperate with the Russian one. My understanding is that has never come to fruition, but it's long talked about. So there are economic options to talk about, but Brazil wasn't hosting for Russia. I hope that answers your question.
So actually, I just want to come back to something, okay, since you mentioned IBSA. So you started out with RIC, and you started out with IBSA, and then you ended up with BRIC, which became BRICS. So this organization's actually expanded over time, or the things that contributed to this organization have expanded. First by adding Brazil to RIC, and then by adding South Africa. Could you talk a little bit about the rationale for why expansion took place, and are there discussions now about further expansion?
Excellent question, and very timely, as it happens. RIC, if you ask India, Brazil, and South Africa, RIC did not expand to include Brazil, right? There was RIC, there was IBSA, and then there was BRIC, small s, BRICS. And they all formed for slightly different reasons. So yes, the membership is very overlapping, but the reasoning, they all have some similar reasons and some different reasons. BRIC, which still meets at the foreign minister level annually, is much more on the counterterrorism security side in Eurasia. IBSA was much more on the development economics side. And BRICS now sort of has all of that together, including a counterterrorism, I forgot if it's called a task force or something, working group. In terms of South Africa coming into BRICS, most of the writing, at least from the Russian side, written by Russia BRICS scholars, and from my own reading in terms of other secondary sources, is it's basically about China. China wanted South Africa in. South Africa also felt very angry about being excluded precisely because of the two other IBSA members were in it. And so from 2009, which is the year of the first Independent Leader Summit, was lobbying very hard. They brought like a huge delegation under Jacob Zuma, brought a huge delegation of business people to Moscow to show how, you know, South Africa being in BRICS would be beneficial to all. And as Russia starts moving to this idea of a dialogue of civilizations and things like that, it's also very useful for optics to have South Africa in. But my understanding is Russia was fairly opposed to it, mainly because South Africa, while a very large, important African country, is not a continental power in quite the same way. It is not a global power or considered to be an actual aspirant to, regardless of how South Africa may see itself that way, but certainly in the US and Europe, that is less understood than it is for India, China, and Brazil. So South Africa comes in essentially, I think, for tactical reasons that then get spun up into more rhetorical reasons. In terms of future expansion, there's the fun glib side of things, which is everyone trying to figure out how you keep the acronym. So there's Kazakhstan should join because then it can be actually BRICS. There's the other side, people who think that BRICS is completely nothing, and so Nigeria should join because then it would be BRICS, it would be on the brink of something. This is all legitimately articles that have been written, so this isn't just me making things up. But you also have a conversation about, well, do you need Indonesia, which is a major regional power in its own right? Then it would be BRICS, and you probably work with that. What now seems to be getting floated by China is a BRICS Plus format, and Russia has formally said that it will support that during its chairmanship year. A corollary, but to me very interesting conversation about BRICS is the nexus of its anti-Americanism or anti-Westernism with other goals. So Turkey at a certain point was getting talked about, could it be a member of BRICS? And there was an answer that no, it couldn't because it's a member of NATO, right? And these are two very different organizations, not only in membership, but in purpose and in level of institutionalization and a variety of other things, right? And Turkey and NATO is obviously a hugely important and relevant conversation at the moment, which I'm hoping you won't make me talk about. But from a BRICS perspective, it is not necessarily related. So there is clearly, at least from the Russian perspective, a division that you can't be a part of major Euro-Atlantic institutions, not global, but Euro-Atlantic institutions, and also be a member of BRICS. And I think that that plays into it also.
Okay, here.
David Fishman, Independent. Former Ambassador William Hill wrote an interesting book about a year ago, No Place for Russia in the International Security Situation. And looking forward, looking at BRICS, looking at it from our perspective in terms of needing to figure out what a forward-looking U.S. foreign policy ought to be in the years ahead, vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis Russia. What do you see and what do you prescribe in terms of, you know, BRICS reflects a reality that a lot of the world sees the world differently than we do. How should we relate to that? And how do you think we will relate to that? And where do you think it'll lead? Those are three obvious related questions.
Sure. Before I did my PhD, I worked as Bob Legvold's assistant for 3 years. First on a project at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on redesigning US policy toward Russia, and then on a project at Carnegie Endowment working on Euro-Atlantic security. It was called the Euro-Atlantic Security Initiative. Underpinning both of those, but particularly the Academy project, was the argument that the US needs to have a good relationship with Russia, not for fun or not because Russia wants it, but because Russia borders every place that we care about. And if we want to get anything done, we will have to work with them. We don't have to like them, we don't have to agree with them, but we have to work with them. It was framed somewhat differently, especially because the Academy Project and EASY overlapped with the reset in a lot of ways, right? So this is a retroactive framing that is perhaps more appropriate to now rather than then. And I wouldn't want to put sort of confrontational words in Bob Legvold's mouth. But it is, I still fundamentally agree with that, right? I think Russia has become a much more malign actor in the US, in the international system than it was a decade ago. I still think we need to figure out how to work with them because they still border every place we care about. And Russia has proved itself to be enormously adept at being a spoiler, right? It has important seats in important institutions. It also is not wrong about everything it says, right? I think you can think Russia is a malign actor while also recognizing when it makes a good point, right? You have to have nuance if you're thinking about this. But fundamentally, right, we need to figure out a way to work with a Russia that we don't trust, that we think has bad intentions both for the US domestically and also for US power globally, and for a Russia that is trying to carefully sway other major actors to be more anti-American. I say carefully because Russia under Putin is under no illusion that China is going to get up and say, we agree with Russia, we're out on the US, right? That's not going to happen, and Russia knows that's not going to happen. But, because I'm tight. There is clearly a calculation of, can Russia get more countries on its side, right? And you see Russia pushing, for example, the idea of a cybersecurity agreement. There was a UN resolution, there were, right? And sitting in the US, you know, that's laughable and maybe horrifying, right? The idea of, but it is pursuing a different idea of the internet, a sovereign internet also, right? Which is something China also supports. So we may not agree with it, but there's a lot of countries out there who do, right? So we need to figure out a way to manage that, not just so that we can remain a hegemon. And I should be really clear that I'm actually not an America declinist. I think power is shifting. I think it's really unclear what that's going to mean. China is not as strong as everyone thinks, domestically, economically. It's strong. It's going to be a player, right? But how this all shakes out is still TBD, not to put too fine a point on it. But just because it's uncertain doesn't mean it's unknown. And what is known is that the distribution of power is going to change. Even if we still hold the preponderance, we're going to have a lesser preponderance, right? And Russia is still going to be very capable of being a global spoiler, right? We have a history of working with a Russia we don't trust. It's called every arms agreement during the Soviet, under the Soviet Union. This isn't, well, I guess that was rocket science, but this isn't something that we've never done or can't do, right? I've sat in on a lot of Track 2 projects. I'm part of young professional groups that are Track 2 projects themselves, including the Younger Generation Leadership Network, which started as a US, Russia, Ukraine forum in 2014 or so, right? To get younger scholars and leaders thinking about how you could build a more productive relationship. And something that comes up in a lot of these conversations is you need to build trust. I actually disagree. Trust is great, but you need to build agreements that are verifiable that you can work with, right? And we know how to do that in arms control, even if we're not doing it anymore. And we need to figure out how you do that in other areas. And that's sort of about BRICS, but it's mainly about US-Russia. And BRICS will end up playing into it as we figure out what the rules of the road are.
Okay. Here.
Thank you for excellent presentation. So this may be a little bit on the margins of BRICS, but you mentioned the Polar Silk Route and the Russia, China, up and down the Bering oil, gas, mining, shipping component.
Sorry, I was coughing. Can you just repeat the
Oh.
question?
Apology. That you mentioned on the margins of BRICS, or the Polar Silk Route between China and Russia, Polar Belt and Road between China and Russia. And sort of tabula rasa in a certain sense, but evolving. And it would seem that there would be a fairly significant, as time progresses, economic relationship, oil, gas, mining, shipping, and then you have melting ice that used to be bulwark, so you have will have a whole open northern front, if you will. How do you look at this in the context of U.S. interest? Is this a problematic, or is this like, you can grow, and maybe we even get to be part of it? Or how, not to be glib, but how do you look at that dynamic in the framework of what you've been describing? Thank you.
Sure. So I find the Arctic fascinating. I did a short project on it as an Easy Herford Fellow of Carnegie Endowment in 2016, looking essentially at the history of US-Soviet space cooperation for lessons for US-Russian scientific cooperation in the Arctic, which is to say it's a space that I've thought about, but maybe not from that perspective, so I will give it my best go. I think Arctic development is something that the US is sort of playing catch up on. We've historically, during the Cold War, the Arctic was basically about security, and the Russian Arctic was a closed zone, right? Russia has 50% of the Arctic coastline, and since roughly 2009-ish, I don't remember the exact date, they've been pouring a lot of money into developing the Northern Sea Route and building it up. That has also included building a lot of military installations. There's some question about whether that's a militarization of the Arctic versus the Ministry of Defense is the one with the money and the one that knows how to do this, and so they're building all the things. And it's probably both, right? You'll notice I don't like either or answers. And the US, President Obama was the first sitting US president to visit the Arctic, and that happened in 2015 when we held the chair of the Arctic Council. Thank you. I'm sorry, I had a momentary brain freeze. We are clearly, we're starting to think about it, and we're starting to think about development for, the extraction of oil and gas and what that means for preservation or for economic development. We're starting to think about it in terms of access to deep water resources, right? Who controls what happens outside the 200 nautical mile EEZ, right? A lot of what's under discussion is actually more going to happen in terms of the ongoing process under UNCLOS for the continental shelf and who owns what part of the continental shelf. And since the US is not part of UNCLOS, we're not part of that, even though we have some competing claims. Denmark and Russia, for example, have something that geologists are going to sort out at some point in the future. But I think US thinking about economics in the Arctic and also just a general presence in the Arctic is nascent compared to Russia, because Russia has long thought of itself as an Arctic nation at the popular level, not just at the political level. Whereas the US at the political level has long known it has an important Arctic coastline and Arctic installations. But if I grew up in Manhattan, if you grab someone on the street there and say, is the US an Arctic nation? They might say, well, we have Alaska, right? They're not thinking about it necessarily, right? I think the role of China is really interesting. China wanted for a while to be an observer on the Arctic Council, and Russia was not for that. Mainly, I would argue that, and this goes into all of its other institutional creation, Russia likes to keep things small and elite, right? And if you have the Arctic Council and everyone in the Arctic Council is an Arctic littoral state, letting in other countries makes it less small and less elite. They ultimately figured out a way to do it. There are other observers as well. But China has been making a lot of pushes on the Arctic. And since Jeff may know this, I don't totally remember if the sanctions involving technology for extraction of hydrocarbons in the Arctic is still covered by the US sanctions. It was. Mm-hmm. Is it now still? Yeah. So that one is still in force, right? So because of that, that means that help that Russia needs for extracting the hydrocarbons in its Arctic EEZ, it needs tech, and that can only come from China because it can't come from the US or Europe who are implementing these sanctions, right? So there's a lot of overlapping reasons where it's a changing climate and therefore a changing economic situation. The US is playing catch up on a bunch of levels there. And China has long been interested in getting involved and was somewhat stymied by Russia, and Russia is now in a position where it has to stymie China significantly less, right? There's always a happy gloss of maybe this will just facilitate trade and make it smoother and cheaper. Maybe it won't. Maybe it's a political play, and maybe it's both. But I would say that the US probably needs to think. I think recently a lot of the conversation about the Arctic has been either about resource extraction or about defense capabilities on the US side. And I would argue that we need a much more comprehensive and fulsome strategy. And if any of you know if we have produced that I didn't see, please do feel free to correct me.
I'm not sure we have comprehensive and fulsome strategies for a lot of things. Back here.
Thank you very much. Nar Checkham, Russia Observer. There's a statistic about a year ago that I came upon that kind of surprised me about trade between Russia and China. 74% of the trade is in US dollars. What does that tell you?
Sure. This is actually something that they've done a lot of work on, and that you consistently see statements about if you see either a sideline meeting between Putin and Xi, as happened at the Brasilia summit a month ago, or just in terms of regular contacts, efforts to move more trade into the national currencies, right? You have a problem because the renminbi is not fully convertible. People don't really trust the ruble. It is a full float, and it has been since December of 2014. I think December, maybe a little bit earlier that year. So there's structural issues there. But something that gets talked about in the BRICS context and also in the Russia-China context is moving more trade into settlement in national currencies. I think the problem there is that you, at least on the Russia-China side, you have two national currencies that countries don't necessarily want to hold in bulk. But I think that if either of those, if the ruble, well, the ruble has mostly stabilized, or at least somewhat, right? It's no longer doing the crazy up and down that it was doing in late 2014, where it, I was living there at the time, and I went to bed and there were about 60 rubles to the dollar, and I woke up and there were 75, right? It was very exciting. It's now more at the 60-ish, give or take. I think it's been a little bit more volatile recently. But if you have that settle down, or you have an RMB that is either fully convertible or that Russia is willing to hold in bulk, I think you will see that number skyrocket, because both Russia and China would rather not settle in US dollars, and that's more about us than it is about them.
Right, they would rather not be exposed to US financial sanctions. Okay, here on the aisle.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the Foreign Service. I'd like to ask about a small issue, but perhaps it might be insightful. Have you ever thought of looking at, in these in the BRICS countries, in the 5 foreign ministries, how high up in the pecking order are BRIC affairs handled? For example, in the State Department, in the Bureau of European Affairs, obviously NATO and EU issues are handled at a higher level than the Council of Europe or the OSCE. So I'm wondering if there's any kind of comparison at what level that's handled in the countries and what kind of staffing and resources are available to the people who work on the BRICS issues.
So that's a profoundly important question. I can answer it with respect to Russia, not with respect to the others. And with the caveat that I haven't looked at the exact level in a couple of years, so I can give you a rough but not sort of a play-by-play. In Mead, in the Russian Foreign Ministry, all of the sort of informal multilateral groups, which is to say G7 when Russia was a member, and it was the G8, G20, and BRICS are all handled by Ryabkov, who is the Deputy Foreign Minister. There we go. And his staff covers all of it. I would imagine that many more of those resources are spent on G20 than are spent on BRICS. Russia's BRICS project also started with the foreign ministry, which is interesting considering it was nominally an economic idea. Even Russia would say, sort of, that it was both political and economic. And you don't see, for example, the Ministry of Trade and Development or the others getting involved until later in the process, or the Ministry of Finance. You now have, Russia will send a representative to all of the majors, so there's a central bank governor meeting of all the BRICS central banks, right? And Nabulina would be there, as would the others. But if you're looking at how far down, I think the question there is, it's growing. And I don't know that firsthand, but by inference. And the inference is as follows. I mentioned that they're now having upwards of 100 meetings per year across the different working groups. The last time I counted, which was when I was finalizing the manuscript for publication, so that would have been early 2018 or so, you had, of the 100 meetings that happened, I think for the Xiamen summit, of those about 30 were ministerial or above, and the balance were below, right? Which means that for roughly 70 meetings, and these are, again, rough numbers, the countries are sending lower level officials. I don't know what that means in terms of the day-to-day work of those lower level officials. And I would imagine it's fairly low, except for the country that has the chairmanship that year, would be my guess. But that's also because while I do think BRICS qualifies as a global institution, which is to say it is an organization on the world stage that coordinates and has actions and has a couple of institutions, it is nowhere near as institutionalized as something like NATO or the EU or something, or even the IMF or something like that, right? It's a much lower rent in the sense of it costs much less money, right? They were working on setting up a virtual secretariat. I have yet to figure out what that means, whether it's a website or something like that, right? But just on a day-to-day, in terms of if you're thinking of allocating hours, it requires fewer hours. But certainly in the Russian foreign ministry side, it's all handled together. So to the extent also that there's overlap, if you're looking at a G20 meeting, but you're planning a BRICS sideline, it's going to count for both sides. In the other countries, I don't know. But my guess would be that it is relatively low, especially at this point, and that it jumps somewhat in years where a country holds the chairmanship. But it is from the beginning, From the beginning, BRICS has been a very top-down initiative, right? It was Putin's idea. Also, I mean, Brazil sort of is a somewhat lesser story there in terms of first talking about it as a political function, but the first meeting in 2005 is initiated by Putin and happens at the deputy foreign minister level, right? The next meeting is again Putin's initiative, and that's the sidelines of UNGA in 2006, and that's at the foreign minister level, right? So presumably their staffs are working to prep them for the meetings and do the books and things like that. But in terms of where the impetus is coming from, it is from the top rather than bottom up.
And you mentioned this virtual secretariat, so there's not like a regular secretariat or a BRICS headquarters between summit meetings?
And there have been debates about that, and it has never gone forward. The virtual secretariat, I believe, actually came out of the UFA summit in 2015, which was when BRICS, Russia hosted, and it did a joint BRICS SCO summit. Mm-hmm. And I believe it compromised on a virtual secretariat, but I will say I'm not 100% positive on that. And I think, as I've said, one of BRICS' strengths is its flexibility and its lack of institutionalization. And if you look at different speeches at different times, you will get different stories from Russian leaders about the level of institutionalization that they want out of BRICS. So that's also one of the complications.
Okay. I see another hand.
Thanks. I'm Jimmy Colker, also a retired Foreign Service officer. Your book title includes the word disruption. And I'm wondering if your opinion on whether Russia and the BRICS partners share the value of disruption. I guess my hypothesis would be that Russia really does benefit from areas of uncertainty. They don't want to solve problems. They want to take advantage of problems in eastern Ukraine and Venezuela and populist movements in the US and so on. They're not trying to solve this or have a direct meeting about how that would happen. Whereas the others, while they might want to reduce US role in governance and rules and norms and predictability and stability, actually do benefit from all of those and would want to be part of a system that was based on rules and norms. I'm curious about the disruption part of BRICS.
Sure. That is something I've thought a lot about. I did my postdoc at Georgetown with Angela Stent and Andrew Cutchins, and the original title was The Transformation of Global Governance, or Global Order, I don't remember. But I had big fights with Andrew Cutchins, spirited debates about whether or not BRICS was actually transforming global governance, and was that what the goal was. And between those fights and conversations with my publisher about what would sell better, we ended up at disruption. But I do think you've identified a really important point, which is to say the difference between Russia and the other BRICS in terms of end goals. I would say that before 2014, all of the BRICS countries, on a spectrum, but all of them were essentially evolutionary, right? Russia may be a little bit more far forward, India may be more over here, who knows, right? Of saying, we want things to change, but things are already changing and we don't need to really give it a shove, right? We're gonna work with what comes to us and amp that up. After 2014, I would argue, and I would say Russian scholars have written things that disagree with this, right? So this is my perspective. I would argue that Russia is at this point a revolutionary actor, which is to say it really wants to just completely change the system. The other BRICS are not. They remain evolutionary. I think China is moving a little bit further. I don't think China wants to blow up the system, but it is confident that things are moving towards it and is moving a little more towards let's push it a little further, but it is still ultimately evolutionary, as is India, as is Brazil, as is South Africa. Russia, in addition to being revolutionary, and this is where the disruption name comes in, I would argue has now, this also comes back to Jeff's question about a common vision. Other than the Concert of Vienna, it's not clear to me that Russia knows what it wants out of a global order other than less US. It is at a point, and I would say increasingly so, but dating from roughly 2014, where its de minimis objective is blow things up. Its de minimis objective is disruption. And then it'll deal with the detritus of what happens after. The other BRICS are not there. But if you're looking at my perspective in the book, which is to say the role of BRICS in Russian foreign policy, that's really the argument, right? There's a chapter on an institutional history of BRICS, there's a chapter on China and India, but the upshot of it is the role of BRICS in Russian foreign policy. Russia has effectively used BRICS to disrupt global order, which is to say, to cause some splintering and then see what happens as a way of lessening US influence in the system.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, what is the role of the Magnitsky Act on all this with the BRICS?
That is not something I've looked at in depth, so I'm going to put that out there. I think it's also important to remember that the Magnitsky Act originally comes into being essentially as a switch out for Jackson-Vanik, which isn't to say that the Magnitsky Act itself isn't important or doesn't identify some real issues that it attempts to solve, right? But the story legislatively of where Magnitsky comes from is Russia had joined the WTO. We were going to be in violation of permanent normal trade relation, PNTR, with Russia if we didn't either exempt them from Jackson-Vanik or repeal it. And Jackson-Vanik, which was really no longer, it was about the emigration of Soviet Jewry in 1974. At 1991 and after, you don't have a Soviet Jewry, right? But it had become...
You also don't have any restrictions on immigration.
You also don't have any restrictions on immigration, right? And so it becomes a proxy for monitoring human rights, which is fine, right? And then Magnitsky sort of switches that out, and then Congress is able to extend PNTR to Russia. I remind people of that history to say that Magnitsky comes from a place that is not about, I think, what BRICS and Russia is about, right? Russia obviously dislikes Magnitsky, right? And lobbies very hard for it to be repealed. But I would argue that because the Magnitsky story in the US is more tied to other work streams, if you will, I don't necessarily think they're connected. I think if you're coming at it from a rhetorical level or coming at it from a perspective of Russia very clearly disagrees with a lot of the values that we say underpin the system, and Russia has also worked very hard to promote itself. I was listening to a Russian roulette episode about this recently, actually, that it has worked to promote itself, right, as the preserver of Christian values and the true conservative power, right? All of those narratives get tied up in, what right does the US have to say whether or not Russia is a legitimate actor, right? And that's a lot of what BRICS is about from the Russian side and to a lesser extent the others, right? And it's one of the reasons I work very hard not to say the word legitimate, right? Is that one of the arguments is over who gets to designate which countries are legitimate actors, right? Magnitsky falls under that. Russia argues that the US has been the real disruptor in global order. Putin has said as much multiple times, both in 2007 in his Munich speech, in 2014 in his speech announcing the annexation of Crimea, in his speech later in 2014 in Valdai, in several recent, right? I mean, this is a long-running trend that Russia has obeyed international law, and the US with its invasion of Iraq and Kosovo and a variety of other transgressions is the true global bandit. Right? So dislike over Magnitsky, I think, falls under that bucket, but I don't know that you would see a linking on the BRICS side. Okay, so, and there's the part where. Again, I think that would happen that is something China would deal with bilaterally with the US. It wouldn't get folded into BRICS. Now, whether or not, if that happens, I would not be surprised to see an anodyne paragraph in the BRICS summit, the BRICS declaration next year that says something about, you shouldn't sanction other, for domestic whatever, right? And you've seen language like that for the US and European sanctions on Russia. But I would be surprised if there was a direct calling out of Magnitsky in a BRICS format.
It may be something on the exporting of
Yes.
Western standards or values, which
Right.
we like to use the term universal values, which are not always
So universal.
repeated in the, okay, any other questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you again all for joining us. Again, you can purchase copies of the book outside, and let's thank Rachel.